All right, Pastor Dan, Stephan, thank you so much for joining us for a table talk. We're super grateful. And what we want to do today is we just simply want to sit down. We want to talk intentionally about some topics that are really going to help the church. And church, we love these table talks. And, you know, sometimes we have an element of formality depending on the host or the guest. The host, I'm always the host, aren't I? Depending on the guest. But today what we're doing is we are going to be intentional and we are going to talk about some things that really help us as a congregation. But we're going to strip it back and we're going to kind of give you a bit of a glimpse behind the curtain into some of our day-to-day conversations, some of the things that we like to talk about, because we believe that the Christian life is supposed to be lived progressionally, moving forward. And Pastor Dan and I, we're both passionate about forward progression, momentum in the spiritual journey that we're all a part of. And so today I know that Pastor Dan's going to bring some incredible insight, rhema from heaven, supernatural things are going to transpire.
Okay.
And we're going to be benefited as a result. But before we get to some of the things that we've never heard about before, the Nephilim and
That's right.
all the things pertaining to what we don't yet understand from your realm. What we want to know is just a bit about you. You know, we're very familiar with you as a person, but we want to hear a bit about your past, your upbringing, and ultimately how you got saved, your testimony.
Sure. Awesome. Well, firstly, thanks, Sean, for having me on Table Talk. Table Talk is like my dream to get one day. You know, I've preached in conferences in Melbourne and in New Zealand, and the highlight of my ministry right now is Table Talk.
You made it.
I remember when you told me, "Oh, can we do a Table Talk when you're here?" I was like, "Yes!" Like I felt like I made it. So thank you for having me on. And I was probably more nervous for this than the whole revival, but very excited for today and what God's going to do. So a bit about myself. I grew up in Melbourne, in the Footscray Church. My parents were saved growing up, so thank God for that. That's probably the greatest blessing of my life, growing up in a Christian home. My parents went to church every Sunday and Wednesday. They were part of the church, and so I understood that was the way to live. And probably the greatest blessing of my life is being raised in a Christian home. Very good upbringing. Got two sisters and a brother. But growing up, my parents taught me a lot about Christ, what it means to be a Christian. They were very clear with salvation, what was required. And through my teenage years, I didn't do any bad sins, as people would call it. Like I never drank or smoked, got girlfriends in school. I never did any of that. But at a young age, I'd say probably 14, I was 14 years old. I was really convicted of my own sin. And if I died at that age, even though my parents were saved, I knew that I wouldn't go to heaven. There was still sin in my life, and I didn't have a proper relationship with Jesus Christ. And so at 14 years old, I bowed my knee to Christ and went wholeheartedly for Jesus, and that really, really helped me. And I haven't backslid from that by the grace of God. And now I've been saved for 18 years now, and I've been saved longer than I haven't been saved. And this is my life, and this is all I know, and it's what I plan on doing for the rest of my life.
Wow. Awesome. Well, appreciate that. 14 years old. That's pretty young to give your life to Jesus and have that revelation of sin and that need to really surrender. What was the pivotal moment though that kind of just woke you up to the reality of sin and the need to surrender to Jesus and kind of not live under that salvational covering of your parents?
Yeah. Well, my parents were very clear that I needed a personal relationship with Jesus. And so the things I'll do at home, I wouldn't just be corrected for doing the wrong thing, just say I'm lying. My mum wouldn't just say, "Don't lie to me." She'd say, "If you lie, that's a sin, and you continue in sin, you will not go to heaven, you're going to go to hell."
Right.
And she really pressured that on me, and she explained that sin separates us from God. It's not about whether I get caught or not. It's my character. It's my heart. And so they were very clear with that from a young age. And so, you know, I'll be like 12 years old and being like convicted as in sermons and be like, "Oh my goodness, I'm going to hell." You know, I didn't clean my room properly. You know, like I was so convicted at an early age because my parents put that in me, and they really made sure I understood sin. I understood salvation, what it meant. And they were very clear that I needed my own personal relationship with Jesus. They made it clear I couldn't get saved through their relationship or their life. I had to make decisions for myself. And so at a young age, I did that. And I was probably, it sounds a bit weird, but 12 or 13, I sort of knew what the right thing was to do, but I wasn't fully committed. But at 14 years old, I really understood I'm a sinner. I need Jesus. And I want to be serious about this. And I did it and kept going from there.
Come on. Awesome. And so then you're now serving God. You're a teenager in a growing church. Peer pressure, you know, temptations, school, you know, all sorts of things that are alluring and distracting. How did you stay saved? How did you stay engaged, stay focused on God?
Yeah. I'd say the two main ways I stayed focused on God. Number one is I jumped into every ministry possible.
Yeah.
So at 15, my pastor sat me down and was like, Dan, you're in too much ministry and you need to relax a little bit. So at that point, I was in 3 bands. I was in the song service. I did lights for the concert scene, and I was doing sound ministry. So I was doing 6 ministries as a 15-year-old kid.
Wow.
And pastor's like, you need to step down one of them. So I think I stood down from lighting because I realized that was like the smallest one. And I wanted to stay in all the other ones.
Yeah.
So I got involved in everything. I ran the choir for 7 years in Footscray.
Wow.
I started that when I was 17, just turned 17. I needed people to pick me up. I didn't have a license to my own choir practice, so people needed to pick me up and take me there. But everything. I went on every impact team. Wherever the impact teams were, I was on every single one. I remember one of them I wasn't allowed to go on because there was like too many people. And I was like cut as that I couldn't go on an impact team because that's just what we did. And, when I got a part-time job, I worked at a chemist, at My Chemist. And I made it clear to them that I was in church, and not only church, but I had ministries too. So on Saturdays, when we had a concert, this would be my Saturday routine. I'd catch a bus at 8 a.m. to get to church by 9 a.m. for band practice. Band practice from 9 till 10. 10, we'd go to Baker's Delight and get some breakfast. 11, we had prayer. 12, we had outreach till 1. At 1, I'd catch 2 trains to work. Then I'll work from 2 to 5:30. Then I'd catch another train, 2 trains back to church by 6 for sound check. Sound check will be 6 to 7. 7 will be prayer. Then concert will start at 8.
Wow.
And so they wanted me to work full day Saturdays, but I'm like, I got outreach at 12, so no, it's not going to happen. So I was working, and I made sure my work fitted in with my ministry, not my ministry fitting in with my work.
Yeah.
So that would be the main one. I just jumped in absolutely every ministry possible. And the second thing that kept me saved was just the fear of God. I think that came from my parents too. Like, I was too scared to get a girlfriend in school because my dad will kill me. And so I was like, no, this is not going to happen. Or I constantly felt conviction. So even in school, when there was peer pressure, I felt conviction. And so that their voice didn't outweigh God's voice. I really had a fear of God at a young age. And I definitely credit my parents for that, for teaching me that and establishing that character in my life. Because if I didn't have a fear of God, I probably would have done all those things.
Yeah.
But they never appealed to me because I had an awe and respect for God. And I realized that he was watching everything I did. So yeah, those would be the 2 things, the fear of God and just being at absolutely everything. I didn't have time to backslide. I was too busy
Cool.
at band practice, choir practice or something. And that was a great blessing to my life.
Well, that's awesome. And that's what I really love about our fellowship too, just the expression that we can have as young people.
Yeah.
I got saved as a teenager as well, 17, obviously not raised in church or in a Christian setting, but it was definitely ministry that kept me engaged as well and kept me busy and away from other temptations. Yeah. And it is such a good thing, I think, for young people to be able to be given opportunity. And so
absolutely.
all those ministries and, what a blessing it is. And to see you today, musically gifted, and that has helped further your ministry, which we'll perhaps begin to touch on now. As you grew through different ministries as a teenager, it was evident that you had a burden, a desire to preach the gospel. Yeah. I think calling, purpose, pursuing burden, they're things that all of us need to kind of realize as Christians. Yes. But it's one of those things that can sometimes be very confusing. It can be a bit hazy to dial into what God specifically has for you, preaching the gospel. Obviously, it's an emphasis in our fellowship, evangelism, discipleship, church planting. We really focus on the preaching. Yeah. When did you personally know? Because not everyone's called to preach the gospel. Right. We're called in different areas, but to preach the gospel. When did you begin to feel that stir to preach the gospel? Yeah,
I remember very clearly. We had a thing called preacher's pulpit. So what it was is some of the men in church could preach like a 10-minute sermon just to the men. I remember doing that. Well, very young. Might have been 15 years old, very early on. And I'd spend, 40 hours putting a 10-minute sermon together. Like, I was so stressed about this 10 minutes, and I'd probably preach for 6 minutes. But I remember doing that, and I didn't feel like a very heavy burden to preach, but it was almost like a little glimpse, almost like a whisper of God, like, this is the direction I want you to go in. And so I remember my pastor at the time said, if you feel God's calling you to preach, come and speak to me. So that night afterwards, I went and spoke to him. I said, look, I don't feel it like super strong or clear, but I feel like God's pushing me in this direction a little bit. So, and he was very chilled about it. He said, okay, thanks for letting me know. And that was it. It wasn't very deep. Then I went on an impact team to New Zealand. And during that time, it was an incredible time because I got to spend quality time with my pastor and some of the other brothers in the church. And we were just, driving into outreach, and that time just reaching people in another nation for Jesus. God was really dealing with my heart then, thinking about how can I prepare myself to be called, and what can I do to be a pastor. And we drove 3 hours from Auckland to Rotorua, and that whole trip up and back, we were talking about calling and what's required to be a pastor, and how to prepare my life as a 15-year-old to be a pastor later on in life. So those things God was dealing with me about. I remember one day in particular coming home from school, and I just had a really big burden for people at the time. Again, this was 15, 16 years old in high school. And I went to my mum and I was talking about it, and I just started bawling my eyes out at home. And I came to the revelation that if my friends at school don't get saved, all of them are going to hell.
Wow.
And I felt the weight of that, and that really affected me. And so I started witnessing at school. I did some Bible studies at school. Some people came to our church a couple of times, and so I wasn't able to lock anyone in, but I was definitely known that I was a Christian and telling people about the love of Christ. And there was an old quote that convicted my heart. I think it's by Spurgeon. And he said, people ask, how can those who have never heard about Christ actually be saved? And he says, well, the real question should be, how can those who know the love of God and know the gospel and don't tell other people about it, how can they actually be saved?
Wow.
That's the true measure. And I was like, oh man, am I saved? And so I made it my goal that I'm just going to witness. I'm going to do everything I can to win people for Christ. And I knew that God had called me to preach. I had a desire for people, love for people.
Yeah.
And I just did as much as I could for people. And that cultivated that calling and that hunger to be used by God.
Yeah. No, awesome. I definitely think that a heart for people is always a clear indicator that, you're going to be effective. People sometimes want to preach because they just like the sound of their own voice. And if you've got a heart for people, and as a 15, 16-year-old, you're inquisitive and you're thinking about what you can do to prepare yourself, that's a clear indicator that God's definitely at work. So let's kind of touch on that. You mentioned driving in the car, speaking with your pastor, and as a 15, 16-year-old, thinking about what you can do to prepare for that future calling of preaching and pastoring people. What choices did you make along the journey while you were still in the Footscray Church, under the covering of your pastor, before you stepped into pastoring itself? What choices did you make to be prepared and to get closer to being ready for that moment?
Yeah, very good. I think from that drive to Rotorua, very clearly it was our jobs. I wanted to be an accountant. I loved maths was my best subject at school. I loved accounting. And so that's what I wanted to do. So university, I think that's 4 years. So I'd finish high school at 18, then I'd do 4 years of uni. So I'll be 22. Then I'd have to do another year to get another qualification. I can't remember what it was. So I'll be 23. Then I'd have to start working, then pay off all that debt. Then I'd have to get married. Then, so if I went down that path, I'd probably have to, I'd get sent out by nearly 30 years old. And that's not really what I wanted.
Yeah.
I wanted to get sent out young. And so I needed to find a job that I could study and get paid at the same time. So I looked at some apprenticeships. Eventually I got a traineeship doing project management for the power lines, and they paid me to study. And it was like getting paid a full-time wage to study. So I did that, and that prepared me. I could save money, I could work, and I could get married younger. And so I planned, I got married younger. I got married at 21 to Beck, and with the whole goal that we're going to get married young and we're going to get sent out young. So on my work, I prepared for that. I prepared it through marriage and also through music. I realized if I'm going to get sent out, I'm going to have to do a song service by myself.
Come on, karaoke.
So, yeah, I didn't want to be the karaoke bar when people walked in. And so I played piano and really pushed through in the worship of piano. And so when people came in, I was hoping that I could play and they'd feel the presence of God.
That's awesome.
So those were the things at that age that I did. Obviously, I should have done like another 15 things, but those are the things that helped me and prepared me to get sent out at 23.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And no doubt like you mentioned earlier about involvement in church, all those practical things with ministry are so key. And we don't send young pastors off to seminary, where they develop theological skills. We're very practically trained. And I think with all of our services, if we apply ourselves, and just through the course of this week in the ministry, no one would be able to walk in here to one of our revival services and say, this guy's not seminary trained, because you're very theologically sound, your doctrine is on point, and that's evident of your relationship with God. I think if we read our Bible, we pray, we're engaged in church, we're doing all of these things, we're going to be really, really, really well prepared. But those are great answers. You mentioned Rotorua. I'm seeing all the connections here. It was the impact team to New Zealand, God stirring your heart in a car ride. Now you're in New Zealand preaching the gospel. How did all of that materialize? Did you always have a burden for New Zealand? Is that why you went on that team? And do you love New Zealand? Was that always the thing, or what?
Well, okay. I went on that impact team because I wanted to go on every impact team. It doesn't matter where it went to New Zealand. Okay. And then you're saying, did I always love or want to go to New Zealand? Absolutely not. Not for 1 second. I actually said to God, I will go anywhere in the world except New Zealand.
Wow.
It was not in my heart at all. I used to mock Pastor Jeff Stowers. He was a friend of mine at the time. And he's like, you're going to come to New Zealand for sure. I said, I am not going to New Zealand. He's like, God's got a sense of humor. He's going to send you to New Zealand. I go, I'm not going to New Zealand, bro. This is not happening at all. No intention. And then there was one conference. It was actually the conference I met you. I think it was 2012 in Perth. And Scott Lamb was preaching. Yeah. And he preached the sermon on hell. And he explained hell. And he spoke about the
metronome? The
metronome sermon. He spoke about the smell of hell. He spoke about the darkness of hell, the feeling of hell, the loneliness of hell. And he had a metronome going. And it was, I can't remember how many beats it was. It might have been 110 or something. It's how many people die every minute. And every click was someone dying. And he talked about the flames of hell. Oh my goodness. I was so convicted. Yeah. I was like, I needed, and basically he was like, people are going to hell. Every metronome, they're going to hell. What are you doing about it? Yeah. And I was like, okay. And so I went to the altar at Perth conference and I prayed and I said, God, I will go wherever you want me to go. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Whatever, I'm all yours. And as clear as you're talking to me, God said, I want you to go to New Zealand. Like, what the heck? Are you serious?
Anywhere but there.
Anywhere but there. Didn't you hear my last prayer? Yeah. I was actually sitting next to Jeff Stowers at that conference, that sermon as well. And so he said New Zealand. And I said, well, God, you need to equip me. And he says, yeah, I'll help you. And that was it. That was the end conversation. Wow. And I was crying. I couldn't stop crying. I think we went for lunch that day, and I was just crying the whole time at lunch. Yeah, probably thinking it was the weirdest guy. So it's this guy crying over his chicken. But then I had a burden for New Zealand. I went and told my pastor at the time, and he wasn't too keen on sending me to New Zealand straight away, which I was totally cool with. Normally our first stint pioneering is local. Yeah. And then Pastor Elliot came and took the pastor of the Footscray Church. I explained it to him. And he said, all right, let's pray. We went to Nando's. We spoke about it. He loves Nando's. And so I was trying to win him with Nando's. Yeah. And we prayed about it. And then a couple of months later, he said, yeah, I believe we're going to do it. Let's do it. Wow. And so we went to Auckland, never been there. Like, I've been there, but didn't know what suburb I was going or anything.
So the only other time you'd been there was that team.
Yes.
Prior.
Yep. Yeah.
That's amazing.
That's it. I didn't know anything about the place. I didn't know anyone there. No one, not one person.
Amazing.
I must have so much faith back then, because explaining it now, it's crazy to send a 23-year-old to another nation who doesn't know anyone just to go start a church. And I was like, yeah, this is going to happen. I had no doubt about it.
That's cool. Yeah. Well, it's been a really exciting journey, and the church has definitely grown, and God's really blessed and helped the church. Coming up to almost 9 years of existence there in the Auckland area. Started in Onehunga. You're now known as Central Auckland. Yeah. And it's an incredible, work and move of God. Church, we're all very familiar with what's happened, and it's been enjoyable to watch it all happen over the years. But as you look back over the past 9 years, what would you say as a 23-year-old stepping into another nation, which you didn't really want to go, but God put it on your heart, you were obedient. And from the very first opening concert, you've always had activity.
Yeah.
But there's probably been a lot of learning curves that you've had to navigate through, pioneering, and now pastoring a thriving church with a baby church out, and no doubt many more in the future. But what would you say are the biggest learning curves that you can look back on and say, man, that was something?
Yeah. Well, they say you learn more out of your failures than your successes. And I was relatively successful in the body in Footscray, which is probably a bad thing because I wasn't able to establish deeper character and deeper wisdom. And so going over there, God helped us very quickly. We had a good core of people immediately. Our first service had 17 people in both services. The next week had 17 in both services. Then we never went under 20.
Come on.
And so what I learned though is I don't have all the answers. So growing up in church, I thought I had all the answers because I've been in church for 20 years, my whole life, man. And so I've seen everything, but I haven't dealt with everything. Yeah. And I don't know how to deal with situations, and you deal with people at different ways and different times. So I didn't ask many questions to my pastor, to others around me. I just thought, I know what I'm doing. God's called me here. And there's another quote that says, you can have a right heart, but make a wrong call. And so I don't think I had a bad heart, but I made a lot of wrong calls. And if I just asked questions, it would have saved me a lot of problems. There was one time I was dealing with some stuff in the church and some pretty major stuff, and I didn't ask for help until like right at the end. You know how we do that? We don't ask for help until like the world starts crashing down and stuff. Yeah. And so I didn't ask for help early enough. And then I remember one afternoon I was just dealing with it. I'm frustrated. And I walked out to the lounge room at home, and Beck was on the couch, and Beck was crying. And Beck was like just feeling it as well. And I was so convicted that my actions were now hurting her just out of my pride. And if I just asked questions, it wouldn't have to be like this. And so that taught me, that was a very humbling moment. I felt horrible. I felt like an idiot. I think I even spoke to you about that time. And so from that moment, I've learned to ask questions a heck of a lot more, even asking questions to things that I think I know the answer to. So sometimes I found out I didn't have the answer, or I see a different angle that I didn't see before. And so I have to say, the number one thing I've learned from pioneering is to ask questions and seek wisdom. As the Bible says, seek wisdom, seek understanding. And I should have done a heck of a lot more of that before. I think because I only knew like this much, then like the circumference, is it the outside? Like you think you know heaps, but the more you know, actually it's the more you realize how much you don't know. Yeah. And the more I've grown, the more I've realized so much I don't know. And so that I really learned to ask questions. And that was the biggest learning curve for me, is to humble myself and ask, should I do this? What would you do in this situation? And Pastor Elliot has been instrumental in this. Yeah. Even recently, like our church, most of our church lives in the south side of Auckland. I was looking at buildings there, and he said, Dan, why don't you look in the central area of Auckland? And I was like, most of our church is in the south area. Doesn't really make sense. He says that people in New Zealand travel, and if you're in a good location, in a good building, people will come. So I found a building in central Auckland. I spoke to him about it. He said, yeah, I think you should do it. I was very hesitant. I was like, but everyone lives far away. And in New Zealand, we pay over $3 a litre in gas and petrol. So no one in Australia can complain. Anyway, I did it. And then I was praying for like 150 people for our first service. We had just hit like 120, 130. And I was like building faith. I had like epic faith to believe for 150. Our first service, we had 165. And I was like, oh, snap. Oh, man. And it just kept growing and growing from there. And I wouldn't have picked that building if I didn't ask a question. Yeah. And there's no way we would have had that revival come through if I didn't ask those questions. So the biggest learning curve for me, seek wisdom, seek counsel, and ask questions on everything. Yeah. And it helped me heaps.
And again, going back to just our fellowship, that's just the cool thing. Over 3,000 churches. The unity that we have is unique. And it's amazing that we can ask questions of our peers and we can observe what's happening in other locations and get ideas. But we always will have a pastor. And what a blessing it is to have a pastor.
Absolutely.
To be able to run things by, ask questions, touch base, and just even this week, having you come in another set of eyes, you can just see things from a different perspective and say, hey, why are you interpretive dancing in the song service? Not that I'm doing that.
Supposed to be after the service, not during. Yeah.
but you can kind of see and correct those things. And so,
Yeah.
so that's great. Asking questions, that's a big learning curve. I guess similar question, but being even more transparent and looking a little bit more inward. Would you say that there's anything that you can look back on that was perhaps a flaw or something that was restrictive or a hindrance within you, and you've identified it and been able to change it? Or what have you learnt most about yourself personally over the past 9 years?
Yeah, good question. We got 3 hours, right? Yeah, a lot I've learned about myself. Number one, I learned that I have extreme pride issues.
Wow.
There's a book called Ego is the Enemy.
Yeah.
Might as well be called Daniel Stephan, because I'm reading it. I'm like, this is me. One time I was like literally in tears reading it. I'm like, this is me. I have major ego problems. Oh my goodness. And so I learned that because especially at the start, I was a lot harder on people over small things. Like now, it takes a lot to get me like really fired up. But back then, the smallest thing would get me upset.
Wow.
Actually had two ladies in our church. They got saved in the first year that we started. They actually gave me one of the biggest compliments, and they said, "Pastor, you're a lot softer on us now. Like you still lead us right, but you're a lot softer on us now." And I think I was way too hard on people. No, I don't think I was too hard on people, and they weren't ready for that. So I've definitely learned that I needed to humble myself. And so when you're humble, then you can be kinder to people, because kindness is maturity. If you're not kind, it's just immaturity, really. The third thing I learned is that God is doing a lot more than what we can see, because we're very naturally physically focused, but God is doing so much more behind the scenes than he is just in front of our eyes. And so sometimes I'm really disappointed. Like there's been some sermons, like they were just horrible. They were so bad. Like I was embarrassed. Just wanted to close the service and go eat pizza and cry, And then I'll get like 4 messages that night. Man, Pastor, that was deep revelation. God really spoke to me about. I'm like, what the heck? And so God is doing more than just us.
Yeah.
And then finally, I think the thing I've learned most is be intentional about things. So if you want disciples, be intentional about discipleship. If you want whatever area, if you want people to be generous, be intentional about that. Not just pray and just hope that it happens, but what are some things you can do intentionally to get that to happen? Not necessarily this week, but in 5 years' time, what can I do from now that will get us to this point in 5 years?
Yeah.
And so I needed to be a lot more intentional. The earlier years, I just thought discipleship would like just happen over time. But that's not true. I needed to be more intentional. And when I did that, that's when our church actually changed.
Yeah.
So those would be the things that I've learned inside of me.
That's awesome. And I'll compliment you. Hopefully it's not oversharing, but I can definitely testify that I've seen God do an awesome work in you as an individual. Watching what God's done in the church, amazing. And I know you don't want me to glorify the stats and the figures of the church, but it is an incredible church, and it's attributed to your leadership. But I'll definitely say that you as a person has grown astronomically as well in terms of humility. I remember that day that we met, and I left the fellowship thinking, that guy from Melbourne, he's pretty
big, man.
He's pretty out there. He's pretty loud. He's pretty noisy, and strong.
Oh, man.
But definitely the humility that you have and the way that you lead the people there in that church is incredible. That you don't build a church to the stage that it's at and with the maturity and strength without looking inward. And I think that is a neglected leadership trait. Being able to look in the mirror and humbly acknowledge what's going to hold me back. There might be certain parts of our personality that get us to a certain level.
That's right.
But we spoke about this even before we flick the cameras on. There are going to be things you have to change about your personality and the way that you lead and the way that you process life if you're going to get it to the next level.
That's right.
And we can only do so much. I don't know if you want to answer this question because we've kind of even touched on it. And if not, then just tell me.
Yeah.
And we'll just continue on with a different thought before we wrap this up. Because time is flying by and we're getting to the end. But if you could start again, the process, is there anything that you'd change? Obviously, you've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but
Yeah.
is there something that you would throw in?
Yeah. If I could start again, one, I'd be a lot kinder to people. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
And so I should have shown how much I care for people firstly.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be definitely number one. Number two, like I said, I'd seek wisdom a lot more. I talk with Pastor Plummer a lot more, Pastor Elliot a lot more. And I never did that in the past. If I did that, it would have helped me a million times. Number three, I wouldn't be so wound up. Like, I think it's the Arab blood in me, but I'm always like tense, and people can usually see it in my face. So I need to learn to change my face.
I must be Arab too.
Yeah. You've got a little bit of Arab blood in there.
Yeah.
And so I had to learn, don't let little things just throw you off. It's a little thing. It's all about Jesus, and just lift up Jesus. Doesn't matter about how you feel or what you're going through. Those things, people skills wise. Spiritually, I wish I had a deeper prayer life before I got sent out. Because when you get sent, you're so dependent on Jesus. You can't do it by yourself. Like you said, talent can get you so far, but you must have a deep relationship with Jesus to get you through. I wish I was deeper in the scriptures. I wish I had a bit more emphasis on Bible reading and doctrine. And finally, I wish I just learned people skills a lot more. And those things, if I did them earlier, would have saved me a stack of a lot more a lot more trouble. Emotional intelligence, these things that I've learned from you. And I asked you questions, and I ended up doing a whole sermon series out of some conversations that you and I had, because I realized this is an area I need to grow in, and it's something God worked on me about, and then I was able to play that out in the church. So those are the things I'd work on if I had to do my time again. But like I said, you learn more in your failure than in your success. So I'm grateful for the times.
Yeah, definitely.
Even though they sucked really bad. Like having 40 people not show up one weekend and leave your church, that's hard. But it was the best thing for me, because now I know what not to do. Yeah. And that God really did a work in me. And so if those things never happened, I definitely wouldn't be at this stage now.
Yeah.
And so now I embrace failure. It's like, okay, that was good. What do I learn? What do I need to develop? What do I need to grow in? So God could take me to a new level after that. So.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I guess in terms of questions and looking back into your past and your experiences, that would kind of bring us towards the end of it. But if you were to speak to our church and those that are tuning in and listening and have jumped on tonight, maybe they're serving God in the local church, maybe they are a disciple, a young disciple even, who is feeling the call of God like what you did. Maybe they're wrestling with calling, they have a burden, but they're fearful. It could be a range of different things that we've touched on, but speaking directly to the church, the disciple, or the up and coming church planting center, like you're a church planting center. What would you say as a form of encouragement? What could you throw in and just build us up, give us some direction, give us some vision, preach to us for a minute before we're done?
To get clarity from God on your calling, you need to do two things. Number one, you have to understand there's no difference between those who are called to preach and those who aren't called to preach. So if you're called to be a preacher or you're not called to be a preacher, you should spend the same amount of time in the prayer room. It shouldn't be there's one standard up here for the call to preach, and then if I'm not called, I can be like lukewarm, I could be late, I don't have to join ministry. That's not true. Jesus says many are called, but few are chosen. So what that means is that you're called for something. There's the called life. We are all called to the called life, and there's one standard, and there's discipleship. There's no two tiers of discipleship. Those going to be a preacher, and those who are just going to be in the church, a pillar. Called to the same level of dedication, of influence, of serving, of everything. So that's number one. Number two, God never called a person who wasn't working. So I have some guy, I'm not sure if you have this in your church, but some people come to me, Pastor, I don't feel like God's calling me to do anything, but they're not doing anything. And so the calling of God is found in the needs of men and women. So when you serve others, that's actually when you hear from God. God never called someone who wasn't working. When he called Moses, he was tending sheep. When he called David, he was tending sheep. When he called the disciples, they were working for his Father. And I can go on and on and on. But every person God called, they were working. So if you want to hear the voice of God, it's not by standing still. It's actually by running and doing the best that you can. And so you might not feel anything, But there's one level of discipleship. We are all called in one aspect. There's one tier. There's no two tiers. And if you give yourself to that, maybe you'll hear the voice of God. And this happened recently in my church. Maybe 2 years ago, a man who got saved maybe for 6 months. After a men's discipleship on calling, he said, Pastor, I don't know what my calling is. How do I know? I said, just keep coming. You'll figure it out. And he's coming. He got involved in ministry. He's doing really well. He's doing all sorts of things in the church. And just last week, he said, can I just talk to you, Pastor? I said, yeah. He says, the other sermon, God spoke to me directly and says, I want to use you, and I want you to be a preacher. So this is nearly 2.5 years after he asked that question.
Wow.
But in that 2.5 years, he hasn't just been sitting on his hands doing nothing.
Yeah.
He's been serving, being loyal, being faithful to the church, loving people. And because he's been moving, now God's calling him to another level.
Yeah.
So if you can't hear the voice of God, or you're not sure, you run with all your might, just as you would if you were a pastor, and prepare yourself in that element. And God might call you to be a pillar or a pastor, but God will speak to you because he speaks to people who are moving forward in the kingdom.
Come on. Very encouraging. Very encouraging. Thank you so much for all your time.
Thank you, Sean. I'm so glad. And as I close, you are one of my best friends. Thank you for your influence. So just for the Central Church to know, this is your assistant pastor. We should probably pay him a wage. But I appreciate your friendship and helping me through so many things through the last 10 years. And our church wouldn't be the same level if it wasn't for you. So thank you for your influence, your love, from you and Mary towards us and our church, your family to our church. And I really appreciate your friendship.
Well, appreciate that, my man.
Amen.
Awesome. And church, God bless you. As you can see, a lot of good things from Pastor Dan. And I hear rumblings that, you might need to start saving money because we're going to go visit them in
It's going to happen.
in the future.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, God bless you tonight.